I've always prided myself on being upfront with the people I choose to be with, but my last relationship ended in a way that shocked everyone. My fiancé, our friends, and even our families. My ex was the kind of person who was meticulous, reserved, and serious. At first, I admired those qualities, but over time, her constant need to plan and control every detail began to wear on me. There was no room for spontaneity, no impromptu dates, no surprise purchases, no unplanned actions. Even our future together was mapped out with precision. She had scheduled our wedding and the timeline for having kids years in advance. It was overwhelming. Eventually, I reached my breaking point. When she started to squeeze even our romantic evenings into a rigid timetable, I snapped. After a heartfelt conversation, I packed my bags and moved out. The first few weeks on my own were uncomfortable, to say the least. Adjusting to my new rented apartment and bachelor lifestyle felt odd and unfamiliar. But after a couple of months, I began to find my footing. I got to know some of my neighbors and started to feel more at ease in my new life. One neighbor, in particular, caught my attention. She was a stunning blonde who lived just down the hall. Her bright smile and expressive manner made her impossible to ignore. She had an energy about her that was infectious, and her laughter could light up a room. I often saw her with a man, a tough-looking guy who drove an expensive car. Their relationship seemed intense. The entire block once witnessed a loud, public argument between them, complete with jealousy-fueled accusations and high drama. Not long after, the guy disappeared for nearly a month, and she seemed visibly heartbroken. Seeing such a vibrant woman looking so defeated was unsettling. One evening, I ran into her at the grocery store near our building. She was at the checkout, struggling to bag her groceries. They looked heavy, so I instinctively stepped in to help. "Let me give you a hand," I said, smiling as I picked up the bags. "These are pretty loaded, and it looks like we're heading in the same direction." She looked up, a little surprised, then offered a soft smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Do you live around here?" I asked as we walked out of the store together. "Yeah," she replied, her voice shy but warm. "I try to get everything in one trip to avoid going back out later, but I guess I underestimated today. The weather's nice," I offered. "We could take a walk if you'd like." She sighed, as though carrying more than just the groceries. "I'm Violet," she said after a moment, introducing herself. "I'm Lincoln," I replied, trying to break the ice. She hesitated before adding, "Don't think I'm always like this. I'm just going through a tough time. My boyfriend cheated on me, and well, I ended things." Her tone carried a mix of bitterness and sadness. Without thinking, I responded, "Any guy who lets someone like you go is out of his mind. But, for what it's worth, time heals." She gave a faint smile. "It's getting better," she admitted. We didn't talk much more that evening, but I walked her to her door and handed her my number. A couple of days later, she called me. We went for a walk and talked more. She seemed lighter, more at ease than before. On our next date, she was completely different. Her smile was brighter, her energy vibrant again, and her flirtatious side emerged. The sadness was gone, and in its place was the cheerful, lively Violet I'd first noticed. We started seeing each other more regularly, and it just worked for both of us. Violet had her own rhythm. She might disappear for a week and then call me at 2 a.m., asking me to go out and talk. We didn't make plans or overthink things. Spontaneous dates became our signature, and entire weekends together felt like magic without any need to discuss what lay ahead. Then one day, she told me she was pregnant. It was a shock, an exciting one, but I didn't know how to react at first. I was thrilled yet overwhelmed. I dropped to one knee and asked her to marry me, and without a moment's hesitation, she said yes. Her face lit up, and I could see genuine happiness in her eyes. However, her pregnancy wasn't easy. Violet became emotional and anxious, often crying or feeling upset. There were complications, and sometimes she needed to be taken to the hospital. I stayed by her side through it all. On those nights when she was admitted, I would pace outside the hospital windows, calling the doctor constantly to check on her and the baby. When she was finally discharged, relief washed over me like a flood, but fate wasn't done testing us. Just as things started to settle, my boss sent me on a business trip to a nearby city. The pay was good, something we needed with a wedding and baby on the way, but leaving Violet at such a delicate time weighed heavily on me. She assured me she was feeling fine and encouraged me to go, but my gut told me something wasn't right. A few days into the trip, I tried calling Violet every morning, but for some reason, I couldn't get through. Finally, when someone did answer, it wasn't Violet. It was a stranger's voice. "Violet lost a baby," the woman said. I don't even remember how I made it back home. My mind was in a blur, but my heart was racing. I rushed to the hospital, desperate to see her. When I found her, she was inconsolable, sobbing uncontrollably. I held her tightly, trying my best to comfort her. Silent tears streamed down my face as I cried with her. As I stood there, shattered, a doctor passed by in the hallway. His face looked weary and detached. I couldn't contain myself. "Charles," I called out, grabbing his arm. My voice was shaking with desperation. "What happened? You said everything would be fine." "Yes, I did," the doctor replied, his tone cold and distant. "But I also told you to be careful. No sexual activity while there was even the slightest risk of miscarriage." His words hit me like a freight train. I felt the room tilt, and my anger boiled over. Couldn't you have done something? Anything? I demanded, my voice rising. "You just let it happen." The doctor slowly shook his head, offering no further explanation. His detached demeanor left me standing there, stunned and helpless. I went home that night, trying to process everything. My mind was racing, my emotions raw. Deep down, I knew it wasn't the doctor's fault. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if he had hidden a mistake, if there was something he could have done but hadn't. Doctors have their own way of masking their failures, don't they? I tried to convince myself it wasn't my fault, but sleep refused to come. My thoughts churned endlessly, tangled and heavy. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my keys, I left for the apartment. What I found there sent a rush of anger coursing through me. The place looked like a war zone. Empty bottles, cigarette butts, and a lingering scent of a man I didn't recognize. My mind reeled. I could barely hold myself together. I wanted to confront Violet right then and there, to demand answers, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wouldn't let one moment of weakness destroy everything that a few days later, Violet was discharged from the hospital. I picked her up, and we drove back home in silence. As I took her bag from the car, she suddenly turned pale and clutched her stomach. "I feel terrible," she murmured. "I think I need to stay with you." I didn't say anything, just quickened my pace toward the door. She followed, her steps faltering. When we reached the door, she froze. "I forgot my keys," she said, glancing at me nervously. Something in her voice made me turn to look at her. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't understand at first. "Sorry for what?" I asked, the words sharp in my throat. Her voice broke as she began to confess. "My ex kept calling, begging me to come back. He said he realized his mistakes and wanted to marry me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't decide whether to stay with you or go back to him. When you left, he came over, and things just happened. I stood frozen, my heart sinking. The words didn't register at first. It felt like everything I thought I knew about us, about her, was shattering. You went back to him." I finally managed, my voice colder than I intended. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was confused, Lincoln. I thought I loved you, but then he came back, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't even look at her, the woman I had been building a life with. The one who made me feel like I was finally moving forward, was standing before me, broken and lost, tangled in a past I wasn't a part of. Taking a deep breath, I forced the words out, even though they felt like they were suffocating me. I can't do this anymore, Violet. I can't keep fighting for someone who doesn't even know where they belong. Her face crumpled, and she reached out as if to touch me, but I stepped back. Lincoln, please don't leave me, she begged, her voice trembling. I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I felt completely detached. I'm not leaving you, I said softly. You've already left me. The silence between us stretched unbearably. She stared at me, her vulnerability and confusion laid bare. But the man I had been, the one who would have rushed to comfort her, to fix everything, was gone. In his place was someone tired, someone who had given all he had and had nothing left to give. I think it's over, I said quietly, finally breaking the tension. Her lip trembled, but she didn't say anything more. She just nodded, and it felt like the end of everything. The life I had imagined with her, the future I thought we'd build, it all vanished in an instant. I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I grabbed my things, walked out the door, and never looked back.